Hi guys, welcome to this overview of reproductive physiology lesson. Just to give you a sort of an idea of how the physiology, at least for the remainder of this block, is laid out. We have this introduction, which I hope will be relatively short, less than one lesson, less than one full lesson. We begin the in-depth coverage of reproductive physiology with the female reproductive endocrinology. This is a fairly complex topic, and as a result of that, it is double the length of a usual lesson. So when you're planning your time, you can figure double the normal amount of time to study for that physiology. After that, the male reproductive, this will basically be all the physiology there is for the first two cases. After that, the male reproductive endocrinology will be presented with infertility, and this will be the first case in my judgment where you're going to need both the physiology of both sexes to be able to properly judge what may be going on. Certainly it's a broad topic that involves the physiology of both sexes. And this is one normal length lesson. And then we have pregnancy, which is with the teen pregnancy case. And that is one normal length lesson as well. So we basically have three, one double lesson and another lesson, which essentially are female topics. And that's because the female reproduction is, quite a bit more complicated than the male, which will be covered in just one lesson right here, okay? So this is the way it's laid out. I think it's logical pregnancy would go with teen pregnancy, that we'd introduce the male in the first case when we really needed the male physiology to make a judgment about what's going on. And I think for the first couple cases, this will be adequate for you, okay? So having said that, let's launch into this. This overview will be basically some introductory stuff. We'll cover sexual differentiation, and then a brief introduction to control of the reproductive system, the feedback loops that are involved. We'll do a chronology of changes in the system, how you progress from pre-puberty, childhood, all the way through adult and menopause. We'll cover puberty and how it's initiated in some detail, at least some of the current theories. And we'll briefly cover menopause. Most of the mechanism will come later in a later lesson, but it's a convenient place to cover, for instance, some of the secondary functions of estrogen and things like that. Okay? So the role of the reproductive system, very simple. Survival of the species only. The species has to have reproduction in order to continue. Reproductive function not required to maintain homeostasis, not really required for life. You will want some of those reproductive hormones at reasonable levels, or it's going to affect your life. But nevertheless, you don't have to be able to reproduce to be able to live, and I think that's fairly obvious to all you guys. The components can be broken down into the primary reproductive organs, the secondary sex organs, and the brain and nervous system, the control systems. The primary reproductive organs are the gonads, that is the ovaries and the testes, and these are where the gametes come from. This is the source of the genetic material. The secondary sex organs basically serve to bring that genetic material together and in such a way that it results in a new human. We have the penis, the vagina, the fallopian tubes, the cervix, et cetera, right? These are the secondary sex organs. And then you have your brain and your nervous system. Hypothalamus, involved in the endocrine function, controls the release of your gonadotropins, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and you have your autonomic nervous system involved in reproduction. We won't talk a lot about that, but it's involved in things like arousal. Okay? So, in terms of functions, well, function number one, produce the genetic material, produce gametes, and sex hormones, and by that we mean basically ova in the ovaries, sperm in the testes in the male. Testosterone is the, quote, male sex hormone, steroidal hormone. Estrogen is the, quote, female hormone. I put those in air quotes because they exist in both sexes. Estrogen might be highest in the female, and testosterone might be highest in the male, but there's testosterone in the female, there's estrogen in the male, and they do have their functions, which cannot be forgotten. And then maturation, or really union of the gametes, then transported maturation, basically pregnancy, okay, for the rest of the functions really involved in just bringing that material together and making sure it all forms and is delivered properly. Back to the sex hormones a little bit. We talk about testosterone and estrogen, which for our purposes basically means estradiol. The first thing you'll note is that the vast majority of what we call testosterone and the vast majority of estradiol is bound to proteins. A lot of it's bound to albumin in both cases. And in fact, only 2% of it or so is actually free in the plasma. The rest of it's sort of like bound and circulating in a bound form. There are different forms of these hormones, which you may hear mentioned. There's dihydrotestosterone. This is the most potent form of testosterone. It's formed by alpha reductase in the target tissue itself from testosterone. DHEA, I'll bring up in a moment. It's a very abundant circulating androgen. As far as the estrogens are concerned, estrone is most abundant in and after menopause, and it's not very potent at all, which won't surprise many of you. There isn't a lot of estrogen function after menopause. And we have estriol, which is important during pregnancy and not really at any other time. These two, we won't mention at all beyond this slide. These two, if we mention it at all, it'll just be fairly brief. So these aren't really terribly important to remember, but you may hear them mentioned in other contexts outside of the physiology lessons, and I wanted you to be introduced to them and know what they were, just briefly. But having said that, don't worry about them excessively. Certainly don't worry about these two. Progesterone, another important sex hormone, important during the menstrual cycle and during pregnancy. We'll learn about that in enormous detail, probably more than you ever wanted in the next lesson. So here is our production pathway for the sex hormones, and I think you guys have already been sort of exposed to this. All these steroidal hormones basically derive from cholesterol, and you've already learned about cortisol in the food to fuel block, and in particular, aldosterone falls into this kit class as well. So these are all basically part of the same general sort of like production pathway. Of course, what we're mostly concerned about, testosterone and estradiol, or this is for our purposes, estrogen. Notice that estradiol is made from testosterone, and that conversion is mediated by an enzyme called aromatase, and that is fairly important to remember. It is within the tissues in the male and the female, it's within the ovaries, and it circulates. And that conversion is obviously fairly important if you want estrogen. Something to remember and something which we'll bring back. Another thing on this slide, which you may note just briefly, DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, quite a mouthful. This was mentioned on the last slide. It's produced by the adrenal cortex, so not the testes or the ovaries. It is in both sexes, but it's most important in the female, and it acts as a precursor for testosterone and estradiol. And once again, I'm going to guess that this slide might be the last you'll hear about that molecule. I could be wrong, but It's not going to be a major focus of these lessons in any case, okay? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sexual differentiation before we wrap this video up. Basically, how do two different embryos with basically the same genetic material become either a male or a female? And basically this comes down to how do we define sex. So there are three different ways that we characterize sex. The first is chromosomal sex. The next is gonadal sex, and the next is phenotypic sex. And although we say three different categories, you should recognize that these are interrelated, and in fact they follow one from another. The gonadal sex is determined by the chromosomal sex, and the phenotypic sex derives from the gonadal sex. So if we start with the chromosomal sex, we basically, what that comes down to is, do you have a Y chromosome or not? Okay, females have two X chromosomes, male have an X paired with a Y. And this would be considered male. As far as chromosomal sex is concerned, this would be considered the normal female. And that leads to gonadal sex. If you have a Y chromosome, you will develop testicles, right? And if you do not have a Y chromosome, you develop an ovary. You do not develop testes. And so if we look at this, if you've got testicles, that means you have spermatogonia, you produce sperm. For ovaries, you produce oocytes, right, eggs. You have Sertoli cells if you're a male, and Leydig cells, and these produce androgens and anti-Mullerian hormone. Okay, and in the case of the female, your endocrine cells associated with the ovary, the granulosa cells and the theca cells, these are important, obviously, but they do not produce androgens, they do not produce anti-Mullerian hormones, and as a result of that, you develop phenotypic sex based upon your gonadal sex. If you have anti-Mullerian hormone and androgens, you normally develop a male genital tract and a normal male external genitalia. If you do not have androgens or anti-Mullerian hormone, you end up with female genital tract and female genitalia. Okay? So this is phenotypic sex. Once again, each one of these progresses one from another, and normally chromosomal sex determines gonadal sex. Gonadal sex, through the presence of or absence of androgens and anti-Mullerian hormone, determines phenotypic sex. And there you go. Here's how we have our gonadal sex determining the phenotypic sex here, with the androgens and the anti-Mullerian hormone resulting in the male genitalia. And in the absence, you get the female. Okay? A lot more about embryological development from the embryology people, but that's a brief introduction there. All right, let's stop this video there and launch into a brief introduction to control of the function of the reproductive tract. Thank you for your attention.